Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Elisa Sklar. I'm the VP of Marketing for GIS Planning, and I am delighted to be here today with our guest presenter, Leann Hackman-Carty. Hello, Leann.
Hello.
And we really are very delighted to have with us today Leann Hackman-Carty. Leann, since 2009, has served as the CEO for Economic Developers Alberta, EDA. It's a 300-plus member organization involved in a range of economic development activities. And at the end of 2014, Leann completed an economic disaster recovery project with 11 Alberta flood-impacted communities. In May 2016, she started working with the Fort McMurray region on its post-wildfire business and economic recovery efforts. This included setting up and running the Wood Buffalo Business Recovery Hotline and validating businesses for Red Cross emergency relief. She also led a 10-member technical assistance team to the region, completing a report with over 50 recommendations on business and economic recovery. In addition to her work at EDA, she heads up Hackman-Carty and Associates, a firm focused on community capacity building, resilience, and recovery. At the end of December 2017, Leann released her Master Your Disasters series of guidebooks on Amazon to help individuals, businesses, and communities prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. In 2018, she received Public Safety Canada's Emergency Management Exemplary Service Award for Resilient Communities. In her capacity as the Canadian president of the Institute for Sustainable Development, she works with international experts on innovative long-term community recovery and resiliency programs. In April 2019, she added the role of Managing Director Canada for Jobonomics to address her ongoing desire to create jobs for everyone. Leann, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I am going to pass this over to you and you can begin your presentation. I wanted to remind everyone about the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to put that in there. And I will pass this over to you.
Can you see my slides?
We can, yes, that's perfect.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you very much for setting this up. I know we have an hour and I'll try and get some content up front and hopefully we have some time for questions at the end. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the types, the challenges that occur with disasters, speak a little more specifically around the Fort McMurray work that I did because it's specific to if you're in economic development as a profession. It just gives you a good example of a community where you know, that business and economic recovery piece was so critical. And so some of the things that we did, which hopefully will help you if you are ever, God forbid, in that kind of situation with your communities. Then I'll talk just a little bit about what I call how to stand apart, and I'll explain that. Each of those letters stands for something, so it's easy for you to remember. And then some questions. Elisa spoke briefly about my background. I started my career actually with the mayor of Calgary. I worked in his office for about over a decade in the area of community and economic development. And that's really where I got my first exposure to that whole industry. I've been running Economic Developers of Alberta since 2009, and like Elisa said, that's where I really got my first experience with floods and fires and tornadoes and whatever hits us here in Alberta. I run my own company, and she mentioned the Institute for Sustainable Development out at Washington, D.C. and Jobonomics. So we can, you know, I just wanted to give you that background. So really, when it comes to disasters, there's three types. You've got the natural disasters, which we pretty much see something in the news almost every day. You've got the hurricanes, the storms, the floods, the tornadoes, drought even, you know, earthquakes. Then you've got the man-made, and those are more along the lines of hazardous materials, building fires, power or utility disruptions, terrorism, chemical spills. You think of Lac Mégantic several years ago with the train derailment. So something that is somehow related to a man-made incident. And then you've got the technological types of disasters, and those we're seeing increasingly, things like cyber attacks, fraud, theft, those types of things. And I think every organization and community is having to think a lot more about that particular type of disaster. the reality is that these crises, these disasters, they can actually damage your economy and scare business away. And it can take years to recover. That's what I think a lot of people don't understand. And I'll go more into detail, but it's so important when these things happen that you put that business lens on them, because often they're the ones that are forgotten and they're the ones that actually need a lot of support. I'm not aware of whether you're from the US or Canada on the call, but this chart is a chart that shows specifically the most expensive disasters to date. And you'll see on this particular chart, out of that top 10, 7 of those are in the United States. Not only are they becoming more regular, but the impact, the actual cost of the disaster is on the increase. And there's many reasons why. I mean, when you look at some of these, traditionally, some of those areas may not have been as highly populated. And the more and more dense a community becomes, obviously the impact can become greater and the cost. So that's just a chart, and I know, Elisa, you're going to provide people with this presentation so you can actually have this information later. This chart is specific to Canada, and this shows insurable loss, not total cost, but this was a 2015 chart, and I've put Fort McMurray at the top now because it's actually the most costly natural disaster in Canada at $3.58 billion of insurable loss. So some of the challenges and these are common challenges that arise when a disaster happens. I mean, and I put Abbott and Costello on here because I think it really encapsulates what this challenge is. It's the who's on first piece. When you've got an emergency response, it's very clear who's in charge. In Canada, and I believe in the US, it's an ICS model. So you have one person in charge, everybody else understands their role, and it's very clear. It's a very linear hierarchical process. When you come to recovery, that whole thing breaks down and nobody's in charge. And I think that's why so much chaos happens even after the first responders leave, because nobody knows what to do. So that is a real common challenges in the recovery piece. This chart, it's a FEMA chart, but it actually shows too that recovery phase, it's not clear when short-term recovery starts and ends and intermediate starts and ends. It's a very fluid process, and it's not like on day 10 this happens and on day 20 this happens. Sometimes right after the incident, you're starting your long-term recovery planning because it's that critical. So this just to me is a great visual to show you why recovery is somewhat challenging for many communities. This you could probably put on the same scale for businesses. Another challenge that's common is the vulnerabilities you didn't know you had. I mean, sometimes it takes something like this for you to realize, oh, wow, we never thought one way in, one way out. You see a lot of communities planned where you do have one road in and out of the community. And when that road is blocked, that's a significant challenge, and it could be, it could result in deaths. So sometimes, or bridges, certain things, ways you've aligned your utility lines. So often it's challenges arise unbeknownst to what you thought would happen, but they happen as a result of a natural disaster. Navigating government programs is another significant challenge. I know when it's a steady state, it's difficult figuring out who does what, let alone when you have chaos and a disaster in the equation. But understanding, it's all that more important to understand, well, who does what, as far as what's the local government responsible, what's the state or provincial government responsible, and the federal government, who does what programs are available. That's very critical information up front, because often that work is not done and you really get in a position later and you go, oh my gosh, where do I go? Who do I call? So that's another significant challenge. Communication, I actually like this chart because it just shows what happens in an internet minute. So, part of your strategy, your crisis communication strategy after the disaster, understanding where your various audiences get their information, what's the most effective communication for your message. So this just shows you if social media is not a part of your strategy, I would question why, because that is where a lot of people get their information, in particular, increasingly, when there's a disaster, because it's current, it's immediate. Mental health is also a challenge, and this is one I know personally. I think nobody can live through a disaster and come out the other side as the same person. I just think that's really difficult to do. It doesn't matter if you're on the front lines, if you're, coming in that second recovery piece, it changes you. And for many people, it's very traumatic. I was actually on a phone call recently with Puerto Rico, and they were talking about, even to this day, there's almost a suicide every day. And I look at that and think, wow, that's, you don't think of that 1 year, 2 years out, but it is something that never underestimate your business community, what they're going through, your staff, because they may have been personally impacted as well. So making sure you consider mental health as an important part of your recovery for your community. And then one of the ones that obviously is a big issue for me personally is that supporting and retaining businesses before they fail. I mentioned it earlier during this webinar, but really, small businesses are the backbone of most communities, and they're usually the most vulnerable. Many don't have business continuity plans in place. Many are going to need access to capital right away. So, this is an audience, and I try and tell elected officials too. I say, when you have a disaster and you're on television or radio and you're giving updates, please mention business. Please just say you know that they're hurting, you know that they have needs, and that you will be providing some information, some resources for them shortly, because you care about them and they are integral to your recovery. Because if you do not think of businesses up front, you may lose them. And I think the statistics are 1 in 4 businesses will never reopen, and I've actually heard that stat is higher. But when you think about losing a business and what those ripple effects in your community are, that means 1 less person for the sports team, 1 less person, 2 less kids for your schools, less volunteers, houses that have to be sold. So the ripple effect starts to compound. And so making sure businesses are first and foremost in your plan and understanding who you have is really important in advance. Now I'll go briefly just into what we did in Fort McMurray. And for those of you who remember the incident, this was May of 2016. And this community in particular, it's quite a unique community because there's a town site which has about 80,000 residents, and then you have a significant rural region. In the region, you have Métis settlements, you have First Nations communities, you have smaller communities, you have very remote communities that you can't even access during certain times of the year. So the other issue with Fort McMurray was in the town site, there was a river. And if you lived north of the river, you went north to the oil sands camps. And if you went south, you were actually much better off because you could get to Edmonton or other areas. So, obviously you have one way out, one way in, one way out is a significant issue when your entire community is at risk. And this community was evacuated, the entire community, for almost a month. So at the end of the day, there was 1,595 structures that were destroyed, most costly disaster, businesses devastated. And the challenge really became these businesses, because of the nature of that community, many were originally from Newfoundland, from other parts of Canada. And so when they left to go home to where they were from, how do we reach them? How do we get in touch with them to see if they're even coming back or they know what's happened to their businesses? So this, I know for even me, connecting with their economic development staff, they had 9 people at the time and they were spread across the country. They were in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, and Toronto. Oh, and Newfoundland. So how do you even your business continuity plan for that department, they had not thought out in advance. So all of these things, you never think of until you have to, actually. So what the response was, we went to the Economic Development Department immediately and gave them kind of a draft business and economic recovery plan saying, look, this is the kind of thing you're going to need. So tweak it how you need to tweak it. And they got it approved by their council within, I think, a couple days. And then that became their strategy. And to me, it was really important that they were the ones that ultimately were responsible and accountable for the plan. Because so often what happens is a disaster will happen and everybody stands up, all these different interest groups, and says, oh, pick me, give me the money. And then they do it on behalf of you. So I would encourage you, if you are in an economic development department and you are leading it or have the ability to be the lead on some of this work, that you get in that driver's seat as quickly as possible. The other thing is, in the end of May, I actually got the Canadian Red Cross to fund this, and it was a business recovery hotline. We actually ran it out of Calgary because nobody could be in the community. And we had, I think by August, we had handled over 15,000 calls. We had registered over 4,000 businesses, and we had them go through a survey just so we could understand, what are your immediate needs? Do you know where your employees are? Did you have a business continuity plan? Those kinds of questions. And we fed that information back to the municipality daily, so they knew exactly what the status was of their businesses and who needed help. At the end of the day, when we pulled the stats from our survey, 91% did not have their papers, their data securely backed up, which was quite fascinating to me. It's about 45% didn't have business insurance. 23% didn't have a customer list, so they couldn't even tell their customers what was happening to them. 32% didn't have a supplier wholesaler list. And in that case, you're thinking, some people are wanting to get paid. Well, you couldn't tell them if they weren't watching the news or in your community. Oh, by the way, I'm not in my business right now. I can't get there for another, 6 weeks. And oh, by the way, you want to get paid? Oh, that's interesting. I don't have any money. So these are the kinds of issues that started to arise. Their top immediate needs were operating expenses, understanding what types of financial support would be available to them, getting insurance advice. Many didn't know what they had or what they didn't have, equipment loss, and helping support their employees. So those were the kinds of things that came out of the hotline. But getting that immediate information from them is critical as well, because so often government departments say, okay, here's a program. And yet I question, I go, well, who told you we needed that program? It's not going to meet the needs. So really being able to get the data, feed the data to who needs to hear it, and then to be able to react. Fort McMurray then did a business resource center once they were able to get back in the community, a one-stop shop where businesses could visit, could meet with insurance people, could hear more about the financial programs, have questions answered. So that was where the chamber got involved and their different partners in the community. And then we took the technical team up in January, and that was 10 of us went up and met with over 200 stakeholders over a period of a week. And we did a report with short, medium, long-term recommendations for the community. And it's on our website, edaalberta.ca, if you want to download it, because it just gives ideas of where we saw the potential opportunities for them. And they are now working on many of those recommendations for their community. So finally, kind of that last piece I want to focus on or talk to is what I came up, because I am at the core very simple in my approach, and I need something simple that I can remember. And so one of the things I did after Fort McMurray was I thought, okay, how do we help communities prepare, individuals, businesses? To me, I came up with this acronym, Stand Apart, and I'll go through it. Each of the A, P, A, R, T stands for something. And hopefully, you know, if you ever get in this situation, you can just recall this acronym and kind of recall what the steps are. So the A really is the first step you have to do to get ready is that assess and mitigate your risk. So identify your type of risk. Not everyone is going to have the same kinds of risks, but you know what are the types of natural disasters that are more likely to occur. Is it a flood? Is it a fire? So going through the types of risk first, so you know what you have to think about to prepare. And then ranking your risks. You know, what's the probability or likelihood? Is it almost certain that this is going to happen or very unlikely? As far as the impact and consequences, that's another important one to think about. Could it be a number of fatalities, a total loss of a block of your community? What's the potential impact to that type of risk? And then finally, you know, what are your critical business functions? So what are the things that you absolutely need to get up immediately? Maybe there's a high priority, a medium priority. It might be your computer systems are critical. Could be your employee, your payroll, whatever it is. But identifying what are those critical business functions that need to set up, and it in what order. Then once you've got that kind of piece done, how are you going to mitigate those risks? What are you going to do to help eliminate some of that risk? So perhaps if fire is going to be one of your risks and it's a high priority or high probability, is there ways to use fire retardant buildings or materials in your building? Or maybe putting fire breaks. I know communities are increasingly putting fire breaks around their community, having sprinkler systems. Like, depending on the nature of your business or your organization or your community, what are the types of tangible things you can do to help mitigate those risks? And also, it's always the piece around the insurance is really, you know, carrying the appropriate insurance and understanding what you have. I mean, we all know how those documents can be several pages, but it is critical you understand what you have, because it could mean, you know, staying in business or not at the end of the day. For businesses, these are things for them to think about, you know, having an emergency kit in place, having something you put your important documents in that's critical for your recovery, having a response plan in place. Where are you going to go if something happens? Are you going to go to another facility? I know that in the case of one community we were working in, they had to move their emergency operations center 3 times because each time it kept getting flooded. So, you know, thinking of that in advance of, if this happens, where am I going? Plan A, plan B, plan C. Having that business continuity plan in place as to, if this happens, how am I going to continue operations? Your IT, obviously, you know, more and more companies have their information stored in the cloud, and so that's important. Many communities have redundant servers in even different communities. So making sure that you can access important data if you need it. Your finances, you know, how are people going to get paid? Your banking information, your loans, communication, having that internal and external communications piece readily available. Who are you going to call? Making sure that you have their most up-to-date information. Because what happens is, you know, just because you updated my information last year, what if I moved or I changed my cell phone? So making sure you always have regular updated information there, and practicing these mock exercises. I mean, we all kind of forget. We get busy doing other things. So making sure that on a regular basis, it could be every 6 months, every year, but just making sure you kind of go through those processes and learn and say, okay, you know, based on this new product or service or program that we actually have to tweak it because it's different now. So making sure you take those things into account. Then the second A is really around activating your plan. So determining what's the trigger where you activate your plan, where actually things go live, and who's the one that's going to activate it. one of the worst things, you can do, and I talked to Fort McMurray about this after, they said, they honestly, people said, why don't you activate earlier? They said people live in that community and they see smoke a lot. This was not out of the norm for them. But what changed quickly was the winds and, the intensity of the winds. So, just knowing that sometimes you have to, err on the side of caution, but you don't want to have, cry wolf every time and then people stop listening to you. So having a clear activation plan and who's going to activate is really important as well. Finally, like the recover successfully, I mentioned it earlier. This is a tough part of it, but it's really when your operations get to, resume and your critical functions are recovered, your site's cleaned, your inventory disposed of, all of those things that involve your organization or your business, they pretty much get back to what they were. They may never get back to exactly what they were, and often people talk about a new normal, and that happens. But really getting to the point where you can start to function again on an almost regular basis. And finally, template your activity. I mean, this is something to write down. Make sure you have something in writing that people can refer to. One of the things nobody thinks clear in this type of environment. So having that stuff written down on who does what, who the contacts are, how are we going to deal with this? I mean, emergency managers have this well articulated in their emergency plans, but when it comes to recovery, very few people have this written down. So the more you can put down, the better. And then understanding when your next update is going to be. So don't let it go for 10 years before you look at it again. Make sure that you have it. Someone has it in their tactics to next July, we're going to update our plan. And this person's responsible for it. So finally, just a few resources. The one at the top there is restoreyoureconomy.org if you're not familiar with it. The International Economic Development Council has it as a portal that they have. Lots of resources on there. Best practices, videos, webinars. So for me personally, it was a huge help in both Fort McMurray and the floods. So I'd encourage you to go there. Our organization actually, the second, the Are You Prepared brochure, took the IEDC course that they were running, and we now offer it to communities. And it's really to help elected officials, economic developers, emergency managers, planners, build an understanding of what's important when it comes to the economic recovery piece and how they can actually make some steps now to get ready. And then the toolkit is something that we just updated recently, and it's really something for a community to use as a manual. It's based off the IEDC one, but it's a Canadian version. So if you are in the US, you can download the US version off the restoreyoureconomy.org website. The Institute for Sustainable Development, I work with them, and it's a lot of resources around long-term recovery and transformation. So that's some good resources there, and we're doing some work in various areas, including Florida, Puerto Rico, California, Hawaii. So there's some good case studies, some good support there. And then the book on the right, that's what I did after Fort McMurray, because I couldn't find templates. I thought if I'm struggling to find this information, pretty sure others will too. So I put together just easy to use guides where it's got community templates you can just populate, and business continuity plan you can just populate with the data that's important. Finally, I think there's no question disasters are becoming more costly. Hopefully I've given you a bit of an idea of how to stand apart and really thinking about having a plan for when it happens, not if. I think most of us want, maybe it's human nature, we all just want to think it'll never happen to me. And that's not quite true. I think we're, at some point, all of us will face some type of, and I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but at some point we're going to, experience one of these situations, and just being prepared and having the confidence, what, at least the basics of what you have to have. Recovery's tough. I mentioned that earlier. It's knowing who's on first. If you do that up front, that work, it will be very valuable when it actually happens. Accessing valuable resources. There's stuff out there. Please don't think you have to reinvent the wheel. Many communities have gone through these types of disasters, and they are the first ones to want to pay it forward and share that experience, because they don't want you to go through what they went through. And finally, you know, increasing your overall resilience. I mean, that's really your ability to withstand that shock or to avoid it altogether and recover quickly. I know that Elise is gonna, my link doesn't work, but she's gonna open up a separate slide deck just so you can see this video, because I think it really, I love it because I think it really reflects what this whole area is all about.
All right, let me play that for us.
This is our home. When big waves or strong winds come, everything's gone. It takes so long to build back. Then, when we're almost done, there's another wave. We search for a better way to change how we do things. Bringing in friends. Getting new tools. Together, we did it. Today, we know what to do. And tomorrow, we'll help others to be prepared.
So, I mean, any questions? You know, I know it might have rambled through it pretty quickly, but I did want to leave some time for questions if anyone has anything, any specific things about what we did or anything you want to know.
Oh, sorry, so we do have a few questions, and I'd like to actually start off with a question for you about how GIS data is connected to resilience. Obviously, that is something that's important to us here at GIS Planning, and I wonder how the value of having everything mapped, having maps of all your local businesses, knowing where they are, knowing who they are, and other kinds of GIS data, how would that play into a preparedness plan?
I actually think that's going to play an increasing role in community preparedness. I look at, you know, if you back up and say, what do most communities have now? Unfortunately, many don't even have basic data on their business community. You know, I keep telling people, you need a business retention and expansion strategy in place. You need to understand who is in your backyard. Have as much information as possible, because when this happens, you need to be able to reach out quickly and find out who's where and what they need. And as an economic developer, that's your role. And so the more data you have, the more ability you have to crunch all of the various pieces of information, the better you're going to be able to respond. Because in an ideal situation, say a hazard or a disaster hits one part of your community, to be able to pull up data quickly to say, okay, in this 10-block radius, we have these businesses. One has chemicals on site, one has a generator, one has a grader in place. Like, if you had that level of data, that would be huge for you to understand, to have those overlays of information. And I think you're seeing that increasingly in communities, and I've seen it myself. The more they rely on a GIS system, the better they're going to be able to react. So, You know, if you don't have that in place, I would encourage you to seriously look at it. And you know, maybe you can't afford it all immediately, but as an investment, keep investing in it over time and building up that critical information.
Okay, so Deb asks us then if you could, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but I think it's worthwhile repeating this. She wants to know, can you recommend someone who can teach an educational session for local businesses to educate them about why it's important to have a disaster recovery plan and what it would need to contain?
Well, I know I've gone out to Kelowna. I was doing that with their chamber and did that kind of session at a general level. But you know, sometimes one of the pieces of information I got back from a business, and I thought it was actually quite good. They said, you know, we try and organize, and I think they were like a chamber. They said, we try and organize these events for our business community, and nobody comes. They just kind of go, oh, ho hum, you know, I got other things to do. And so they said, how do you make it exciting? And I said, well, I have one idea came up through some of our discussions, is to have a business person, not an insurance company, present it. Someone who's lived through a disaster, who can say, had I not had this business continuity insurance or this type of plan in place, I would not be in business today. So they can speak from personal experience, and that's always more powerful than someone selling a product, right? Or a service. So that's one idea that immediately comes to mind. I said to a municipality, because they were saying, well, you know, how do we get people to do this? I said, well, have you ever thought to incentivize them? Like if you have business licenses, what if you offer them a discount to say, if you've got a business continuity plan in place, you're going to pay less annually for your business license. You know, be creative in ways you can actually help support instead of sometimes I think communities try and, you know, beat businesses on the head, but I'm saying give them a carrot. Figure out a way to make it that they want to do this, that they see the value. The other downside, I guess, is sometimes you have communities where if I carried business insurance and you didn't, and you get bailed out, that's actually rewarding bad behavior. You know, governments sometimes do that, maybe not knowingly or knowingly, I don't know. But, you know, think of your programs in advance too. You know, if there's an incentive to do something good and save money, then they're going to do it.
So that actually, Bruno asks, how do you suggest we change the culture of preparedness or the culture of being prepared? And I guess some of those tips that you just talked about, incentivizing, offering a carrot rather than a stick. Any other suggestions you might have on changing the culture around preparedness?
Well, you know, I've had this conversation with Red Cross a lot because a lot of their stuff is around individual preparedness. And it's tough. That is a loaded question because I think even people who have lived through a disaster forget. You know, when we went into Fort McMurray, it was shortly after the community was doing their fire break, taking down trees on a certain area, and there were residents saying, why are you taking those trees down? I bought my house because of those trees. And that's right after the disaster. And you're thinking, oh, you know, really? I would have thought that would have changed your behavior. So yes. I think it's a constant educational process. I think all you can do is think about your organization. First of all, your own home, right? As an individual, what can I do? As a business, if you have a business, what can I do to just make sure that I'm prepared? Because it does come down to lives at the individual level. It comes down to livelihoods at the business level, and then quality of life at your community level. So you think these things maybe people don't notice, and it's not glamorous, and it's hard sometimes to get people motivated. But I know right now, like the high level, I don't know if any of you were aware of these high level fires that were happening in northern Alberta, but I got about 5 calls shortly thereafter from communities asking us to come in and train our course. And I think, you know, so maybe using a disaster, that's current in people's minds can actually motivate them. So, just another tip.
They still remember it that way. That kind of emotional memory is still there. Lauren has asked me to mention that LA County, Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation has a step-by-step guide to help businesses prepare for an earthquake, and that can be found at laedc.org/EQ. So thank you for sharing that with us, Lauren. That's be useful for people to see. And kudos to you guys for organizing that. Brian wants to know whether it's reasonable to expect small businesses to plan for disasters, or does it really make sense that it's the EDOs that have to step up to provide out-of-the-box recovery plans or even just guidelines for their small, medium-sized business communities?
Well, I mean, there's two levels there, right? So an individual business is going to have to do their own unique business continuity plan and get their insurance. So there's always that individual piece. At a collective piece, I mean, the EDO can make sure that the businesses have access to good information and tools and resources. One of the things I didn't mention, but I know the state of Florida does this, and it's because they have a lot of disasters. But they have an area on their website that they hide in a steady state. As soon as they have a state of emergency, they unhide that page on their website. That website has all the current information on financial resources, insurance support, what kinds of programs are available, because some of those won't change. I mean, some of those are standard, and maybe there's new ones, but at least if you have all of that stuff ready to go, the second you need to enable it, you can. So, in your case, your question, I think as an EDO, that's a valuable use of your time to say, okay, businesses, how to be prepared. Here's this, that, and the next thing. But when the disaster hits, boom, here's the information you're going to need to recover quickly.
Yeah, that's, I think, quite good advice. And Maury suggests actually that maybe we should start teaching preparedness in business schools to budding entrepreneurs and business people, that should be part of I guess, thinking ahead if you're going to be running a business. Be an interesting thing to be able to see something like that happening. And we do talk about insurance and other things, but that doesn't always get taken to heart. I have another question for you. Can economic developers incorporate renewable technologies into recovery plans? So rebuilding properties using sustainable materials, renewable power, updated specs, etc. Kind of like in the video you showed us, I guess a little bit, is what are things that we can do to be prepared, but also to do it in a way that leaves a different kind of footprint?
Well, I guess there's a couple angles there. One is, and this is a common issue, is many municipalities, many businesses, when you get your insurance, you're basically building back the same. That's what you're getting money for. It's not to build back better. And the discussion is more so going to that, well, now, does that make sense? You're going to build back better or the same. That makes no sense, because I was at risk before and I'm going to put myself back into risk. So there has to be some discussion around how can we build back more resilient. Some of that, there's funding. I know FEMA has grants, but around that hazard mitigation piece, increasingly I think communities are looking at mitigation of infrastructure as ways that they can become more resilient. And I know from a municipal level too, you have the ability, whether it's your zoning ordinances, certain building codes, those are levers to potentially encourage people to do things differently. I think from a planning perspective, that's one that kind of drives me nuts, because I look at communities that get a lot of pressure to develop in certain areas, and you're actually, at the end of the day, putting more people in harm's way. Building on coastlines, floodplains, in forests. I mean, we're on well-known earthquake. I mean, it's just, I know it's tough, but I think increasingly we're going to have to think ahead and build those processes into our communities and say, no. I mean, if you're going to rebuild here, it's going to be to this standard. I think Florida is doing a lot more when it comes to hurricane-proofing homes and saying these are the things as at a minimum that you have to have, because we can't continue to buy you out every year. And so it's a cost thing, it's an incentive thing. But once again, how do we incentivize people to do this? You know, and maybe it is they get a better insurance rate if they do these things.
Right. Yeah. Interesting question. Just a reminder, if anyone has questions, there is a question field in the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I think that the things you bring up, I guess, are very, very important points. And I imagine some of this depends a little bit on the kind of disaster. Some things can be thought ahead. Some things are those 1 in a century or 1 in a 1,000-year events that nevertheless happen. So no matter what, I guess people need to think about being prepared and thinking ahead to protect their communities. Are there any other kind of tips or words that you'd like to leave us with on this concept of economic resilience, which I think is a really brilliant way of putting it?
You know, the one thing you mentioned about the size of the type of the disaster, and yeah, that's very true. The other thing is when you've got, and I don't know if anyone's on the call that lives on an island, but when you live on an island, you have even more complexities because you're importing your food, the logistics of getting you equipment to rebuild, to recover, to respond. I mean, it's that much harder. So there's that other lens you have to think about in advance if you're an island economy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes sense. That would make everything more expensive and a little bit more complex, as you say. Well, I think that takes us to the end of our questions for today. Some really good questions, really important subject, Leann. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thanks to all of you who've taken time out of your busy days to join us here. You can see on the screen Leann's contact information. If you have any questions, you can get in touch with her. You will be hearing with us in the next day or so with a link to the recording, and you can let us know if you have any additional questions. And with that, I will say thank you to everyone and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.